camera, feel free to turn off your camera and you won't show up. So the recording, you won't be recorded. Okay, so if that's your way to opt out and still engage, you can turn off your camera. But we'd love to see your face and have you all engage throughout. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat at any point. Alrighty, folks, I'll hand it over to our friends at Catalyst. California.
No worries. Thank you, Joanna. Hello, everyone. Nice to have you all here this evening. My name is Kiana Ruff. I'm the Justice Reinvestment Manager on our Equity and Community Investments team here at Catalyst, California. And today we have members from our Research and Data Analysis team. Alicia is our Director of Research and Data Analysis, and Jennifer is our Senior Research and Data Analyst. So a big thank you to them for putting in a lot of time with this research, and I'm very excited for us to dive into that today. And also just a big thank you to the other organizations within the coalition for creating space for all of us to be able to dive into the data together, and a warm welcome to everyone who was here with us on Monday. Welcome back. We learned a lot about the city's FY24 budget, and we received a lot of engagement. And I'd also just like to extend a warm welcome to everyone if this is your first time joining the series. So next slide, I'll quickly go through the purpose of the meeting and what we're doing here today, right? So we're going to review the Racial and Identity Profiling Act data analysis to review Long Beach Police Department's traffic stop data. So it's going to be a lot of data heavy, but let it wash over you. Let it wash over you. Feel free to ask questions. We're all in this together to learn. And we're going to just discuss general goals around policy and budget equity recommendations based upon the data. In that way, that could aid to support the coalition as we come together to create a campaign. So here you'll see the agenda. So first we will review the data for about 30 minutes, take a break. Then I'll quickly go over some policy and budget recommendations based off the data. But then we'll give another bulk of the time for you all to be able to go to the website, explore the data, click through it, and then we'll have an open discussion to see how folks are feeling about it, and then also just where your brain is going in terms of campaigns and policy. Then after that, I'll pass it back to Joanna, and she'll go through next steps and timeline. So without further ado, I will pass it to Jennifer.
Hello, so Alicia. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Alicia Mulholland-Graves. Thank you so much for having us here. Excited to dive into this data with you, and thank you, Kiana, for the introduction. So we're going to first go over an overview of the analysis, as well as some limitations of the data that we want you to keep in mind as we go through the presentation, and then we'll really do a deep dive into the findings on the site. So the main finding that we want you to keep in mind throughout the presentation is that the Long Beach Police Department dedicates the majority of its patrol time on traffic-related stops rather than responding to serious safety concerns in the community, and that these stops don't necessarily improve safety. In fact, instead they result in harm and unnecessary contact with the police among communities of color in Long Beach. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Jennifer. So as we go through the data, we'd like to provide context as what we were trying to accomplish with this analysis. We wanted to demonstrate the inefficiencies and the racial bias in how Long Beach police patrol the community for the purpose of generating more support and pressure for alternatives like the People's Budget. To do this, we wanted to demonstrate the narrative that Long Beach police spend more time and money racially profiling folks in communities of color in Long Beach than they spend actually protecting the community or making it safer. So just wanted to provide that context before we get into a lot of data. Next slide. So now we'll go over how did we go about doing this analysis. So we used 3 data sources, but I'm really just going to focus on one right now. So the main data source that we used was data from the Racial and Identity Profiling Act. So in 2015, California passed a law prohibiting racial and identity profiling by law enforcement and requiring law enforcement agencies to collect data on police stops. The data collected as a part of the RIPA Act, when you hear us say RIPA, that's what we're referring to, is meant to monitor for police bias and provide the public transparency and data. So we took this data from the state and focused on stops from 2019 in Long Beach. The reason why we focused on 2019 is because this was the most recent year of data available when we started the analysis several months ago that wasn't affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2020, we saw a decrease in police stops because of the stay-at-home orders. So we started with 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. So we analyzed the data in a couple different ways, and we'll go through these different ways with you. We wanted to look at how officers spent their time on stops. So where were they spending most of their time, what they were doing during those stops, what actions were they taking, how stops were different across race, and then also council districts in Long Beach, and then how traffic stops compare to where traffic injuries and collisions occur in Long Beach. You'll hear us throughout the presentation refer to officer-initiated stops. These are essentially stops that officers decide to initiate themselves in their patrol versus a stop that was made in response to a call for service or a call for service. Next slide, Cheesy. Before we get into the data, there are some limitations or shortcomings we want you to keep in mind. The RIPA data we use is based on officer reports and disclosures. So this means that we're depending on officers to accurately and honestly report what happened during the stop and who they stopped. These aren't the direct experiences or reports of the people who were impacted by the stop. So one way this affects the data is when we look at data by race. So the race reported is how officers perceive the race of the person they stopped. This is often subject to officer bias, which is it's the standard for analyzing racial bias in policing. But what we may see is that some groups may look like they have lower rates of stops, not necessarily because they are being stopped less often in the community, but perhaps because they are more likely to be misidentified by officers in those stops. So we want you to keep that in mind as we go through the data. The data also does not show trends for groups that aren't a part of the RIPA data collection. So for example, there's a broad category of Asian in RIPA data. Then a community like Long Beach, where there's a large Southeast Asian community, we're not going to get to see the trends specifically for Southeast Asians in Long Beach because that data isn't collected as a part of RIPA. The data also doesn't include the real on-the-ground experiences of the communities impacted by these practices and injustices. Next slide. So just to visualize this last point, next slide. They say, right, that 90% of an iceberg is below water. So similarly with data, what we are able to see with the data is just a small glimpse of what is occurring or the real inequities in the community. So underneath the data is something even more important, the real stories and experiences of the community impacted. So we're going to get into a lot of numbers, but we want to acknowledge that behind these numbers are people, the people in Long Beach who have been disproportionately impacted by police stops, including people you have worked with or people on this call. So these numbers alone cannot do justice to these experiences. So we think it's extremely important for community members and advocates to take this data and pair it with community stories to really see the whole picture of this issue and what is occurring in Long Beach and who may be missing in this data. Next slide. So Jennifer is about to walk us through our key findings, and we've split them into 3 main buckets. I'm just going to highlight those 3 main buckets for you, and then Jennifer will go through all of them in depth. So number 1, Long Beach police spend most of their patrol time on officer-initiated stops that are racially biased and not a threat to safety. So police are mostly stopping people for traffic violations that do not necessarily require an arrest or an armed officer response. Long Beach police, so secondly, Long Beach police unjustly target low-income communities of color with unnecessary stops. People of color are stopped most across all council districts for these unnecessary stops. Number 3, traffic stops can harm the community and actually produce a greater burden of communities of color in Long Beach, the same communities that are impacted by traffic injuries and fatalities. So with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer to walk through the data findings.
Thanks, Alicia. All right, so I'm going to take us a little bit deeper into each of those key findings. So for that first one, right, the Long Beach Police Department spends most of their patrol time on officer-initiated traffic stops that are racially biased and they're not a threat to safety, right? So one of the overarching findings that we found in our report was that the Long Beach Police Department spends a significant majority of their time, actually 75% of their time, or you can think of it as 3 out of every 4 hours are being spent on officer-initiated stops. And again, that's really important to consider because officer-initiated stops, again, these are not in response to 911 calls. These are not initiated by the community, right? And because we see, okay, police officers are spending the majority of their time on officer-initiated stops, so let's dig deeper into that then. What types of stops are happening within that category? And what this graph clearly shows us, right, is that police officers are spending a significant majority of that time on traffic violations. And so when we explore the report later on in depth, right, when we do our discussion and website demonstration, you'll get to explore a little bit too what traffic violation means, and particularly what are the common results of these traffic violation stops. And what we found was that the 3 most common stop results for traffic stops are citations. So those are tickets, right? A warning, or no action at all. And so based on this, there are arguments or a discussion to be had over whether or not these traffic stops even need to be patrolled by police at all, right? So now I'm going to bring it back to that racially biased piece of the finding, right? So this graph is looking at all officer-initiated stops by race. And we can see that individuals who were perceived as Black or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander or NHPI, so those who are perceived as Black or NHPI by the Long Beach Police Department, they are stopped at the highest rates. And as you recall from the previous slide, right, a majority of those officer-initiated stops are traffic stops. You'll also notice, right, that there's these bubbles attached to those lines on the graph. Those represent the total number of individuals that were being stopped in each of the racial groups. So I'll quickly walk through an example with the Latinx statistic. So we can see from this graph that the stop rate for those who were perceived as Latinx was 69.4 out of 1,000 Latinx individuals. And this ends up being the 4th highest stop rate relative to the other racial groups. However, we can see that there's that large bubble size on the graph, right? And that indicates that the raw total number of individuals who were perceived as Latinx that were stopped is still a relatively really high number, especially relative to other racial groups. And this isn't surprising, right, when we think about, right, who lives in Long Beach, because we know that there's a lot of diversity in Long Beach, and including a lot of Latinx households that live there. And so I wanted to highlight both sides of that statistic because it's really important, right, to consider the rate, but also the total number of people that are stopped to get a more comprehensive picture, right, when we're talking about stop rates. Secondly, so this is on to our second sort of global finding. The Long Beach Police Department unjustly targets low-income communities of color with unnecessary stops. So this is a snapshot of an interactive map that we made. And again, we will get an opportunity to explore it and dig deeper into it ourselves later on in our presentation. But this map shows officer-initiated stops by race across Long Beach. And you can see each of those sort of parcels is a city council district of Long Beach. And so each racial group has a unique color, right? And each dot on the map represents 10 people who were stopped. And so we could see, even just visually looking at it as a static image, right, that clearly there's some blue and green dots that are popping out, right? So already you could sort of see the racial disparities in who gets stopped by police. And additionally, we could see the concentration of where stops are occurring, which is really important to consider, right? So we could see, right, the city council district, or I have to refer to as CD. So CD 1 and 6 there's these huge concentrations of stops, right? And that's all sort of BIPOC groups are being stopped, right? Whereas in contrast, you can see sort of this East Long Beach area, right? There's relatively a lot less stops occurring, right? And so that kind of begs the question, who is living in these areas, right? Where there's this higher concentration of stops, and who is living in these areas where there's much less stops occurring? So the second map focuses on, again, officer-initiated stops, but that resulted in no action. So the purple shading, right, indicates that there's a higher percentage of hours spent on those stops that had no action as a result. Whereas that lighter shading is a lower rate, right, of those stops where there was no action as a result. And we would like to focus on that result of the stop, especially the no action, right? Because it is a good indication of whether or not pretextual stops are occurring, right? If a stop ends up with a no action as a result, that means that ultimately, right, there probably was not any sort of public threat to safety or serious crime occurring, right? Because otherwise, a stop could have a number of results, right? An arrest, right? Or even a citation, like a ticket. So it's important to know sort of what it means when we're seeing a lot of stops where there's no result, right? Or no action as a result. And we can see a higher concentration, again, of those types of stops with no result are occurring, again, in that CD1, right, CD6, also sort of that northern Long Beach area as well. And we know that that's where a lot of BIPOC people live relative to where there's more white people living. And finally, for our third overall finding, right, stops are an inefficient means of advancing safety, and it inflicts significant harms on people of color. So this map looks specifically at the rate of traffic stops. So again, that's that purple shading, right, with all of our city council districts, right? But it's overlaid with high injury pedestrian or bike intersections in the yellow color. So this is areas where there's a high concentration of these injuries for pedestrians or bikers. And then also, oh, excuse me, that's in red. And then in yellow, we have high injury motor intersections of corridors. So these are just areas where there's a high concentration of motor injuries. And so it's important, it's interesting when you look at the two together, because we can see these areas where there's a lot of traffic stops also have a high concentration of these injuries, right? And so what that sort of visually tells you is that these traffic stops by police are not preventing injuries, right? In fact, there's a concentration there. So that's a really important point that we wanted to highlight. And then additionally, again, right, who is living in these areas that are in fact doubly burdened, right, by these high concentration of traffic stops, right, but also this high concentration of these motor or biking or pedestrian injuries, right? We know that these are residents of color. We also know they tend to have lower median household incomes relative to these other wealthier parts of Long Beach. And additionally, too, it's important that we think about the built environment as it relates to all of this, right? And what is the role that the built environment, not policing, right, has in terms of actually creating safer environments for people. And so here, finally, I think this is the last graph we're going to discuss. So this bar graph shows traffic stops where unnecessary searches were conducted, right? So these are rates of traffic stops where a search was conducted, but no contraband was ever found as a result, right? And once again, this is by race. And once again, those bubbles at the end indicate the total number of people, right, in those racial groups that experienced a traffic stop with a search that did not yield any contraband. And this is important to consider because, again, if we are stopping people in traffic and searching them, but more often than not finding any contraband, we're not finding any evidence of serious crime happening. So why are we subjecting so many people, especially people of color, to these traffic stops? And in fact, community-wide, right, regardless of race, nearly 4 in 5 community members who are stopped for a traffic stop and searched don't have any contraband or evidence of crime being found in those searches. And that statistic increases when we focus on BIPOC folks. So amongst BIPOC folks who are stopped for a traffic stop and searched, 85% do not yield any contraband or evidence. So the bottom line, right, is that we have a high rate of traffic stops occurring that do not produce contraband, but are resulting in these intrusive and traumatic encounters with the police. And so as we transition into the break, again, I just want to quickly acknowledge this is really difficult data to share. It's a lot of numbers and it's a lot of graphs, but we're talking about real people, right? This is not in the abstract. So I just want to acknowledge that as we sort of take a break, right? As Kiana said, let that wash over you, take care of yourselves in whatever way you need. And I'll hand it back to Kiana.
Hey folks, so before we go on a 5-minute break, I understand that was a lot of data. Thank you so much, Jennifer. If there are 1 or 2, we'll have a discussion later, so we'll just limit it to 2 for now. But if anyone has 1 or 2 like burning questions before the break, feel free to go off mute or insert it in the chat. I'll give.
Don't be shy, folks. This is our chance to learn together. We're all learning new information tonight.
I have a question. I might have looked off screen for a second. You guys might have answered this, but in the areas where there's where they don't find anything, right, and it's a wasted time, what's the percentage of BIPOC that they're pulling over there? I was curious if it's the same.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat your question one more time? I want to make sure I answer correctly.
Absolutely. So you showed the areas that were in light purple, right? And they found nothing. But I was curious, in those areas, who are they pulling over?
So yes, in the areas where there's a higher percentage of folks that are not a higher percentage of stops that do result in no action, those communities do have a higher percentage of people of color as well as lower incomes compared to the areas in Long Beach that are the lightest purple that have a lower percentage of stops that result in no action. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
And across city council districts, so when you get directed to the page, maybe another dimension of your question, across city council districts, people of color are stopped at the highest rates. So even in city council districts that have some of the highest shares of white people, we still see particularly the Black community in Long Beach get stopped at higher rates. So yes, the areas in darker purple here do have higher stop rates for people of color, and that is true across council districts, regardless of what the demographics are.
That really honed it in. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, folks.
Like there's one comment from Facebook, and then we can go to break after that in the chat. I can read it out loud. It says, I live downtown Long Beach and have witnessed Long Beach police stop and harass Black people at far higher rates than others. As a matter of fact, I was stopped by Long Beach police while walking after I accidentally stepped off the curb while standing at the crosswalk. I spoke about it at a recorded city council meeting. Of course, nothing was done, but I did have my say. Is Long Beach Police Department racist? Yes. Okay. I have another story about being stopped in Long Beach, but I will save it for another time. Oh, that's a comment. I apologize. I thought it was a question. And for whoever wrote that comment, thank you for sharing your experience with us. And I am so sorry that that happened to you. And just know that you have community who is doing work and trying to prevent instances like this from happening. But thank you for sharing.
Definitely. And feel free to reach out to us as well, connect, right? Share your story so we can continue this conversation together. So thank you.
So with that, before we go and take a 5-minute break, I do want to acknowledge, this information is very sensitive and triggering. So please be sure to, as best as you can, take care of yourself while we continue to go through the data and have our open discussion. And we will be back at 6:42. Have to do math. Okay, we will be back at 6:42. Thank you.
Well, see you soon.
Alrighty, folks. We can start trickling back in. Hopefully everyone got a chance to take a quick break, stretch. Okay, I see a thumbs up. If you could send a thumbs up if you are back. Great. Okay, I see a thumbs up. Okay. Alrighty. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Can I just share real quick for folks to write and type in any questions they have in the chat throughout the presentation? We understand it's a lot of information. So we want to just make sure you all have a chance to ask your questions, and then asking the presenters to just take a moment, slow down just a little bit to give our interpreter a chance to keep up so that folks can understand all of the information as best as possible. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. And thank you for that note, Joanna. So we will start back up. So now I'll go into policy and budget recommendations. It's going to be pretty high level because I really want you all to have a chance to dive through the data, for us to have an open discussion. And yeah, so let's get started. So the first solution is a budget recommendation. And that's justice reinvestment. So reinvesting public dollars to invest in grassroots coalition priorities, such as the People's Budget, that focuses on equitable alternatives to public safety. And so I know like the People's Budget Coalition, us here today, we're focusing on services for the unhoused, banning facial recognition technology, automatic license plate readers, banning that, and community land trust, and so much more. In this, also reinvesting in street infrastructure to improve traffic safety. So investing in updated street designs like bike lanes, lane narrowing, and other traffic calming strategies to reduce speeding and to reduce accidents. So that's kind of like a double-edged sword. It would not only address public safety, but it would also minimize someone's chance of being pulled over by police. So that way, you know, if there are things in place, police less likely have minor violations to use as an excuse to pull someone over. And we'll go to the next slide. The second policy recommendation is to reduce law enforcement's role in minor traffic violations. So exploring ways where unarmed public employees are responsible for monitoring minor traffic violations. So for example, if someone has a broken taillight or if their car is unregistered, that should not mean that they are pulled over by someone who is armed. There's no threat to society that is happening. There's no severe violations happening. So looking at ways where maybe a public employee who is not armed can still address that, but it doesn't have to be from a police officer. And then the third one, thank you, is decriminalization. So basically decriminalizing low-level traffic violations that doesn't pose any significant public safety risk. So what does that mean? You know, minor traffic violations, you know, they're usually viewed as a means to an end, as we heard earlier, in order for police to racially profile Black and brown people. So if we decriminalize minor traffic violations, that would cut down on the number of pretextual stops by police officers. And it'll also create more parameters. So I know a lot of times, and I know Joanna, you mentioned this, that police always say, well, we used our own discretion in situations where excessive harm has been caused. So if there are more parameters around the reason why someone is pulled over, if having a broken taillight doesn't call for someone being pulled over by police, if we decriminalize that altogether, that'll also not accept people to harm, Black and brown people to harm. So and that's a policy recommendation. So 2 policy recommendations and 1 budget recommendation. And yeah, so that's just a high level of what we came up with. Feel free to, if you wanted to write down anything to bring up in our discussion based upon these recommendations, that'll be helpful. But now I will pass it back quickly to Jennifer, and she will give us a demonstration on how to access the data. So now we're going to give you all a chance to click on the link to explore the data, and then we'll come back and we'll have our open discussion.
Awesome. So I'm really excited for everyone to get to play on the website themselves. So I am going to give a very quick high-level overview of how to navigate it. The link should be in the chat. So this is where the link will take you to. This is the online report. You can see in this row here, this is sort of the navigation. So this will take you to acknowledgements. You can scroll right with your mouse, but you can also use that navigation on the top if you want to jump to certain sections, right? So here's the context section, the data section, which there's a lot in the data section. So you will need to scroll to dig deeper into what's actually here, right? The solution, right, which dives deeper into what Kiana just presented. And then the takeaway. For those who are interested, right, in really understanding the research, you can find more of the detailed research methodology. Oops, sorry, that's my timer here. So I'll spend a little bit of time just sharing a little bit more information about how to explore the data, right? So all of the graphs that you will see on the data section are interactive. So that means you can hover and get more information, right, about the graph. Also, fun fact, all of our graphs, if you see these lines here, you can export any of these graphs into images for your use, right, in advocacy, or if you want to share, you know, the images later, right? So you have those options as well. So let me continue. Some of our data is represented in these, we call them tabs. Again, the graphs, you should hover, I recommend hovering over them to get more information, right? There's a lot sort of nested within these tabs as well. Right here we have the bubbles again, right? Again, make sure to hover. And then I'll spend some time on the maps because there's a lot going on, right? So here is that map I talked about earlier, right? Where we have officer initiated stops by race. There's a legend here to explain which color represents which race. And this panel here lets you decide which races you want to see. Do you want to see all of them? Do you only want to see white? Do you only want to see black? So you can sort of play around here, right, to dig deeper. And again, you can hover as well on the maps to get any additional information, including city council districts, right, which are outlined in black. Similar here, here is the map I showed earlier too with the city council districts. Feel free to hover, feel free to click as well to get more information for each council district. And here was that final map I shared. Similar to the map with the dots, you can turn on and off the different injury networks if you want to just focus on one or none, right? So it's up to you to play around. Again, hover and click on things too to explore. And I covered bar graphs. So I think that should be about it for the website demo. I think more importantly, right, we want to give y'all a chance to play. So I will hand it back to Kiana and Alicia.
All right, so we're going to give you all 10 minutes to explore the data. There is a link in the chat. And then if possible, if we could add the link into the Facebook Live as well. And please click around, please read through. I touched briefly on the recommendations, so if there's more you want to read about, please take advantage of that. and we'll give you all a full 10 minutes. So we will be back at 7:02, and then we will discuss these 3 reflection questions that you see on the screen.
Do folks have any questions before we break out?
Thank you.
Yeah. Feel free to jump in or put it in the chat. No? Alrighty, folks, just want to make sure you all are good and set. We'll see y'all in 10 minutes.
So we got about 2 minutes left and then we will be back. 2 minutes. Alrighty, everyone. We are going to start trickling back in. Let me know if you're back, if you could give us a thumbs up. Okay, I see you, Kimberly. Okay. I know you can get lost in the data for my nerdy folks, so. Okay, so we carved out roughly 20 minutes for us to, again, let the information wash over us, let it sink in. And now is the time for, even if, let's say, you may not have an answer to a question that you see, if you have a question, so it doesn't have to be super formal, just whatever you're thinking. So we can start with what resonates with people. But if you have anything else to add apart from that, apart from the questions you see, feel free to come off mute and share, or to add within the chat. And also coalition members as well. You know, everyone is welcome to just talk about how you're feeling. How's your heart? How you feeling? I was asked that today, so I'll ask that. And how does this data resonate with you all? Okay, I see Melissa. I'm struck by thinking that behind every piece of data is a real person with a real life and a real story, and 100% can't disagree with you there. I think that's something that we all should just remember, you know, as we're in this space, or like some of these data points are people we know, you know, or people in our families, or could be us, you know. And that's very real. So even if you know, if you want to just talk about how does this data resonate or just make you feel, you know, given that we're talking about real people here and what that means for us, or what we'd like to do about it. So all comments is welcome. Thank you, Melissa.
I just wanted to say I really appreciated this presentation of the data. I think it's really neat and it resonated with me. It felt like it just confirmed everything that I already kind of knew in Long Beach. But a question I had was, I think a lot of this is going into patrol time of LBPD. And I was wondering like how much of LBPD is patrol time versus other time spent. I don't know if that's like an obvious question or not. But yeah, I just don't know how that, percentage kind of breaks down for patrol time.
That is a really good question. So the RIPA data set is a stops data set, right? So that's sort of the universe, right? So it's not a data set that includes non-stops per se. Does that make sense? Because I'm assuming, are you thinking about sort of administrative, right? And desk duties, things like that?
All of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, but unfortunately this data set is a stops data set, right? So I don't think you would be able to get at that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Just to kind of share on why that focus is important in terms of our work, right? Is that a lot of the narrative and the way that people talk about it and the way that community and the way that police talk about it, especially, is that they're really responding to community calls, right? They're here to increase safety. They're doing it because community is calling on them and that's what community wants and that's what we feel is the best thing. And we know based off of our lived experiences and now very clearly outlined in the data that that's not the case, right? That's just not true. The majority of their time is like you all shared is self-identified, meaning they are self-initiated, right? So they took the opportunity, they decided that they needed to make that stop. It was not a civilian, it was not a community member asking for help. It was a cop deciding that they were going to racially profile or do these stops, right? And so that's really huge for us to think about as we're trying to figure out, how do we reshape the way we talk about this? How do we reshape the way we look at policing, the way we consider what is community safety, right? How are we defining community safety? Who's making that decision? Because as of now, the current narrative, it's police made that decision, right? They're the ones telling us that they're the answer. So we need to really broaden our imagination and look beyond that. So we'd love to hear from folks. Please don't be shy. Feel free to ask your questions, share your reflections.
And I do know sometimes you may not, this could be triggering, it could make you feel a way where you may not want to share. But if there is something you want to do about it, another question we have is, how might you see yourself using this data to advocate for your community? So either way, if you want to talk about how it resonates with you, or like how might you use it in a solution-oriented way, and no answer is the wrong answer. Just what are you all thinking? Yeah. And
I do see a comment in the chat by Josh saying, super valuable to have this level of rigor and data visualization at hand for us. It's validating to have and useful. So thank you all for the hard work on this. May?
Yeah, thank you all for this amazing work. I was thinking about this in terms of like, I'm a biker. I like walking in the city, and I didn't know if it was just my perception, but it kind of feels like things have gotten more dangerous just to walk around. And I know this was even brought up by some other folks at a city council meeting who were not affiliated with the People's Budget, but they were like wearing a bike helmet. And I was like, oh, I resonate with that too, because I also feel unsafe. Like I bike to get to work. I have to go on Anaheim every day. I'm like, am I gonna die? But anyway, the point that I wanted to make is like, it does help us think about safety so much more expansively. And then with that, I wonder if it's also about the alliances we can create with people who may not automatically kind of, who may initially think like, oh, these people who want to divest is just this niche thing. But what this is bringing up is that it's really related to safety for all of us. Like if you're a parent and you want to walk your child to school and it's not safe, what does it mean that we're investing in these things that are actually making people not safe and making it hard for us to do simple things like walk to school? So I guess I'm just thinking about like what creative things can we do to create these alliances and maybe do, you know, actions that involve like bike rides and stuff. Like, I don't know, just like ideas swirling around, but thank you all.
Yeah, can I clarify for folks who may be new to the space, right, and may not be too familiar with people's budget? And Nada, I see your hand. But I just want to give some context because a big part of the work, one of the main things that we focus on in the People's Budget Coalition is how do we divest away from police and invest that back into community, right? Into life-affirming resources for community. And so that's what we're talking about. And that's what May was referencing, right? Where it's what are other things that we need to invest in to really impact and increase safety, right? Because it's not police, right? Police come after the fact and a lot of the times inflict more harm, right? And more violence, whether that's physical, whether that's financial, right? Whether that's incarceration or deportation, right? These are all very real violent acts against our community. And so for us, it's how do we take that money out of that's not helping us and put it into something that does, like after school programming, like resources for undocumented immigrants, like resources for renters, things like that. Nada.
I also want to underline what May said. I'm a walker, and I first of all, every morning, I take my life in my hands. I mean, that people don't stop at stop signs, and that's in the third. And looking at the data, nobody's patrolling the 3rd district, which is where I walk, for those things, which underlines the kind of racial basis for all of this. I mean, I haven't seen a cop I see cops all the time because I do demonstrations, but I haven't seen a cop on my walk in, I'm going to say 5 years. So they're not patrolling, and there are kids walking to school at the same time I walk. So the question is getting the resource, so it's not cops, obviously, to keep me safe, because they're not. And it's doing other things that will keep me and those kids walking to school safe as well. And parents are walking with the kids at ages that, God knows, in my time, we would have died if our parents walked us at that point in life. But I understand why. I mean, they're not going to save their kids, by the way, from the crazy drivers, but it is talking about not patrolling like they do, but doing something else to save walkers, bike riders, kids, seniors, as I am, and have a better city. So I just want to underline that, because it's important to say that this isn't saving us.
Thank you for that, Nida. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. But yeah, and I think it goes to show, if we're putting all types of safety in the hands of police, including traffic safety, and then we see where police is spending majority of their time, it's like not only is harm being caused, but then there are actual things that need to be done in order to keep the roads safe that are just it's just being neglected, and so I think you're right, more investments, I'd say, in traffic calming strategies, right? It's one of the policy recommendations that we have in order to make sure that people are safe, people feel safe to go to work, and I think that's a narrative that's important, because a lot of times when groups like us say divest, they think like, oh, we don't care about safety at all. And that's just not true. You know, it's just, we actually do intentionally care about safety. I think we all want to be safe, but we define how that looks, you know, and that's why we're all here. So I appreciate that. Any other comments, questions at all before we wrap up discussion? We have time, so feel free.
One question for Catalyst. You know, I know that you do a lot of work in data visualization and adding this rigor. Here in Long Beach, we have 9 city council members, and for all of us here, we've gotten to know them through advocacy and organizing. And I'm curious if you have any recommendations or insight for how to take the research that you all do and then translate that in a grassroots organizing capacity to get change here in the city, whether it's from past experiences with other cities that you've worked with or otherwise.
I think there's a few ways. I think you could look at it from a policy or a budget perspective. So like on Monday, we saw how the city is investing more money into technology that's being used to enhance cameras to for facial recognition that police will use. They're adding like another $1 million into the budget. So if you are a person who does budget advocacy, something that you could do is knowing that when we go into these meetings and we're saying divest, like, yeah, it's a tagline, but it's not just a tagline. Like that means taking that $1 million to upgrade cameras and reinvesting it to a solution such as some of the things that we mentioned, like traffic safety laws, for example. So to me, that's more of a budget recommendation, but then also, so what that looks like is creating a campaign, having demands, going to public hearings and conferences after you have the demands that pretty much not just cater to like divesting from police, but reinvesting to enhance traffic safety. So doing it in a very strategic way that, you know, the next fiscal year, and once we see those numbers moved, right, we can, I mean, I'm not sure how many years, how long it takes for RIPA data to come out, but in a perfect ideal world, if we had new data, we can kind of compare and see if the efforts that you made resulted in, you know, less people being harmed or, you know, things of that nature. But also, I would say a policy perspective as well. So I know in Berkeley, California, I think they might be the first city in California where they created a transportation department. And so that department is going to address broken taillights, vehicles that are not registered. I think you can get a ticket for having something hanging from your mirror. Like, who knows that? You know, so they have an entire unarmed department in order to cut down on pretextual stops and racial profiling. So you can look at it from different ways, I'd say.
And I'll just say from the data presented here, so like Jennifer reviewed in the website, you can click on those maps for every council district and get information for each council district. So I know in other areas, maybe some council members may think, oh, this isn't happening in my district, right? That you have that breakdown of stops by race and time spent on stops that don't result in any action. So pairing everything that Kiana said with policy, community power recommendations and community stories with some of that, the data on the site, you can use that as well in your campaigns and use those maps to get further detail by council member.
I do see another question in the chat by Janet asking, is there data on the number of calls for service from the various council districts? I know my neighbors call the police routinely if they think someone has parked on the street for too long or for other minor problems.
So I don't think we did that analysis, but that is available in the data, yes, that is something we would be able to get.
And just something to keep in mind that, again, the vast majority of hours are going to responding to officer initiated stops. So yes, on the site, you won't see in detail by council district the percent of stops that were made in response to a call for service versus an officer initiated stops, but across the board, more time is spent on those officer initiated stops rather than on the calls for responding to community concerns like that.
One note I will add too about calls for service in the raw RIPA data, you can't see a lot of details about the original call in the raw data. Does that make sense? So if somebody is calling because they think their neighbors are being loud, I don't think that detail would be in the raw data. It would just be labeled as, right, globally a call for service. So it wouldn't get to that level of detail of, I'm calling because people are parking on the street too long, or, right, you wouldn't be able to differentiate that. It's just, right, because there's a lot of types of calls for service too. But right, to Alicia's point, any kind, the good kind or the innocuous kind, they're not spending their time on that anyways.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a good point to make. It's like not only are most stops, does the data show that most stops are for pretextual stops versus calling for service, but then you could think about, well, how many of the calls from service were actual emergencies as well. So you're thinking, you know, the right thoughts. Anyone else before we close up? Even if it's a comment, feedback, questions, feel free. Alrighty.
Some
Oh,
gratitude in the chat.
Sorry.
Gratitude in the chat. Nada says thank you.
Thank you, Nada, and thank you everyone for joining us. So yeah, thank you everyone for participating with us, learning together with us today. A big thank you to our research and data analysis experts, Alicia and Jennifer. Their team put in a lot of work to bring this data into fruition. My contact information, as you'll see here, is on the screen. And also I will add it in the chat in a second, just in case if anyone has any additional questions, and I will now pass it back to Joanna to go over next steps.
Awesome. Thank you, folks. So just a few more minutes to go over a few exciting things. So we know this is a lot of information and it might be a little challenging to hear sometimes, right? I know we all come from different backgrounds with different experiences, but just want to give us a chance to really start dreaming and imagining outside and beyond what we've been told is the only way, right? Or the best way. And so I think for us, that's really the biggest thing. We want community input. We want community engagement, community involvement in this process. We want folks to be aware and educated about what's really happening on the streets and in our neighborhoods, and really learn, right? And not just take what we're being told or fear-mongered to, right? They do a really great job of saying like, well, these things have increased, you know, violence has increased. So because of that, we need more police. Or it's like, oh, you know, this is happening, so we need more police. The answer is, according to them, is always, we need more police. Right. But year after year, they're getting, you know, in the first session that we talked about, they're getting over 40% of the city budget every year, plus millions and millions on top of that. Imagine what we can do with that funds, right? With those funds, with that money, if we invested in our communities, if we invested in the programs that we know actually improve quality of life, and improve the way that we're living our lives, right? And that would really impact safety. So just really want to encourage you all to dream big with this and dream big with us, so that we can hear from you all in terms of what are some priorities? How do you all want to see those resources being allocated to community? What's important to you and your family, right? Because you all are the ones in your communities. You know what you need. You know what your family needs. So just really excited to have you all join us here. And if I could have Antonio share the last slide here. That'd be really helpful. So we have two opportunities coming up. The first one is this Saturday, October 21st from 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. this Saturday. And there's a registration link right there for you all to see. So please feel free to join us. That would be wonderful. And then what else? We're going to be talking about surveillance. So anti-surveillance, mass surveillance, state violence, and counterinsurgency in the community. So please feel free to join us that day. You can also join us on Monday, November 6th from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. It'll be in person. We're still finalizing the location, but we're gonna continue this conversation and meet community, and there'll be coalition members there as well. So super excited to have you all join us for that. We have a lot of coalition members, some of who are here. And I know I'm gonna miss a few folks here, but we have everyone from Surge, Orale, we have folks from BLM, Black Agency, Sunrise Movement. We have folks from, who else am I missing? I'm missing a lot of folks, I know. Long Beach Forward, right? So it's a coalition of coalitions, Language Justice Coalition, Anti-Surveillance Coalition, a lot of folks here who care about this issue and want to support community in getting those resources we deserve. So come meet folks, come chat with folks and tell us what you think. And then also check out our page, our website, lbforward.org/campaigns/people's budget, and then follow us on social media, and we have our handles there. We'll be following up with the copies of these presentations in English and in Spanish for you all, along with contact information and handles for our coalition partners. So thank you all so very much for being here this evening. I'm so excited to have you all join this fight. We expect to see you in the streets now and joining us at City Council. It really does start now, right? We have the information we need and we need your support. So thank you all so very much. I hope you all have a very wonderful evening. Take care and we'll be in touch. And thank you to our team. Our wonderful teams, Catalyst California, our collaborators, thank you all. You all have done a wonderful job. Our staff, Antonio, Diana, Mel, Rudy, all of you all have been so amazing. So thank you all so much. And all of the researchers, this was an amazing, piece of work that you all put together, an amazing presentation. So thank you all so much. And to our interpreter, Julie. So thank you all so much for being here. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye, folks.